blanket position, so
Okay.
probably just do 24 hours.
So we know who's on the call. This is Eric and Tim here at Tortigalis. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, and from Kimley Horn, you have Bonnie Von Olsen, John Canning, Alexa, and Dave Shipp is on as well.
From ORES Group, Patty Adele, and I believe Bruce is on.
Yep, hi, Bruce Murray here.
Sabrina, who do you have there in the
In
room?
my office, Sabrina, myself, Jill, Bill, Rob Deary, Steve Tavolacci, Tom Curley, Randy Katchis, and Ivy Poole are present. In the audience, we have Lauren Levine and
Jason
Levin, I'm sorry, and Jason, and we're expecting 3 other folks who are running late, and I'll announce them as they come in.
Okay. And is anyone else on the phone that we missed that called in? There's not. Okay.
So should we go ahead and start?
Yes?
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
So the agenda for today is really to review the process and scope. And we know that there were some questions about that that we heard in the written comments that we received. A recap of the comprehensive plan goals, give a market update where we are in that process, look at workshop number 1 feedback that we received, which was really great, by the way. Then kind of look within the framework of placemaking, the role of kind of land use, public realm architecture programming, and some preliminary recommendations for those things for the development for the code. We'll look at the street network. We'll look at the framework that kind of becomes the basis for the regulating plan. Then we'll take a look at the concept site plan, which are really hypothetical implementations. And then we'll take a look at more detail in terms of the parking standards and recommendations for that for the code. So that's what we have today on the agenda. So for the first thing that we're going to take a look at is really the process and scope. Bonnie, do you want to kind of go through this one?
Sure. We just thought to, remind everybody with the end goal in mind, where we are right now, since we've been going relatively quickly with our sessions with you. Obviously, the large boxes on the left are the big picture review and analysis and public design process, then actually drafting the form-based code and refining it, and then going into the seeker review and the approval. So we started with a kickoff meeting in May 23rd. Our first work session was June 10th, and we're now up to June 25th, the video conference, which we inserted into the schedule because it was a matter of touching base and additional time to be able to get consensus on certain items, and so everyone was following what was being put together. And the outcome of this meeting will lead to what we have set for July 17th, which is again a meeting with your group. It was intended to originally be a meeting with your group in the morning and following with the public sessions in the afternoon. But again, we split it out and set the public sessions to the following week, so there was an opportunity to make any revisions prior to presenting to the public after the meeting on the 17th with your committee. And then we're going to go into the looser schedule of it is basically the first draft of the code in roughly September, refining it, the second draft in roughly October, and then going into the secret process in November, and so on and so forth. That goes by the original schedule that we had in the proposal. Go to the next slide.
So one of the things that I think is really important to understand, because it gets a little complicated when you're thinking about kind of the parallel tracks that you're going through, both policy-wise and in people's heads. So we thought it was useful to kind of highlight some of the things here. So the comp plan, which is on the left side, is really a vision in words. And that establishes the policy, and we're going to go through the comprehensive plan goals it goes through those specific goals. But there isn't a physical kind of implementation of that. You know, what does that actually physically look like, and what are the specific kind of parameters there? So that's where the concept site plan comes in. So that's really a vision in a specific form. It establishes a framework. It starts to really force you to think about what the form parameters are. And it's also, really importantly, it's the basis for the build-out analysis and for the seeker. And then it also gives us an opportunity to look at the market scan and to kind of test some of the things that we're drawing and proposing. So it's really important at this step to understand what the potential things are that could go here, because those are the things that are going to be studied in the seeker and the build-out analysis. So we want to make sure that we've captured all of the potential things that could be here, so that you end up down the road in 2 years saying to yourselves, oh, we really should have studied this. Now we've got to go back and do this process again. Even though we may be talking about some very specific things, some of those things you're not really going to make a decision about as part of this process, but we know that, or you're going to know that those are potentials. Then we go into the form-based code. That's where we actually draft the legislation, we create the regulating plan, really codify what those development standards are, and then, as we talked about, going to the seeker process and the build-out analysis. So right now, we're in the concept site plan stage, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about today. So the comprehensive plan goals, what I've done here is really condense them into a very short way, and I've organized them a little differently than they were in the comp plan. And that's simply because it's kind of easier for us to think about when we think about the code itself. So when we look at the development pattern, there are a set of goals for the development pattern. When we're talking about develop where there's existing adequate infrastructure, that we're developing a transit-oriented development that's vibrant, that it's mixed use, that it's walkable. One of the goals is to increase and diversify the retail, the entertainment, and the civic to attract people from outside of the town, to improve the accessibility of the train service, more specifically the pickup and drop-off, exploring a parking structure, promoting higher density residential, which decreases from the center as you kind of move away, improving the linkages between open space and prominent destinations, having a mix of residential, commercial, and mixed-use infill, and in a way that's very integrated, to address the parking supply, increasing recreational facilities, improving circulation, preserving and protecting historic resources, which is a very important thing, which I think we're going to have some very interesting findings about that we'll present, promoting accessibility, and then specifically to the buildings that the downtown storefronts need a facelift, so having regulations that are having policies that enhance the aesthetics. Also providing a range of housing types that are affordable to a diverse population and maintaining a quaint feel. So then the rest of them we've grouped into environment, activity, public land, and policy and program. So for the environment, it's really about green infrastructure leads, sustainability, reducing the carbon footprint, reducing vulnerability to flooding and erosion, promoting plant and animal biodiversity, maintaining environmentally sensitive areas, and mitigating stormwater. Under activity, the goals are to promote, attract, and retain small businesses and to limit chains and big boxes, to stimulate patronage and activity, increase recreational programming, and increase in nightlife. For the public land, there are a number here that include better utilization of the municipal property, increasing street trees, planters, vegetation, expanding, enhancing, maintaining park and recreational space, improving road safety, non-motorized transportation being an important component, promoting general public safety, and alleviating traffic congestion. And then policies and programs, we have promoting a form-based code, design guidelines, and creating a business improvement district. So those...
And Eric, I just wanted to add one thing on there. So as everyone can see, these 2 pages summarize really the couple of years' work that you folks put into summarizing what the community is interested in for the hamlet. And several of these with your other implementation of your streetscape and your upgrading of the infrastructure. I've already implemented some of these to some extent. So the form-based code is really just another one of the implementation practices to be able to obtain these goals in entirety or in part. So that's really, we want to just keep focusing back on it. That's what this whole process is about, is to provide the form-based code that meets all the as many of the comp plan goals as possible.
So market update.
Just give you an update of where we are. We're not completed within probably 80 to 90% through. Bruce has been looking at comp data for land values, and as we've discussed, what we come up with isn't going to be a predictor of what you can get for your land, but it will help to provide an indication, and depending upon what the form-based code is, we can use that at some point to do some sort of estimate. Won't be really what you're going to get, but such as in Kisco, right now they're going through an RFP process, which some of you might be aware of, for their train station parking lots. And their offers are all over the place, and it depends upon how the parking structures are treated and who pays for them. So the RFP process is really giving them an indication of what the land value is. Having the numbers that we're putting together gives us some sort of feedback on whether it's reasonable and what it could be based on. In terms of the retail market data and residential data, we're almost completed in collecting that information, and we'll be putting together a summary report of the market scan. We hope to finish all this before July 4th. In terms of the retail conditions and the 4 selected communities, we have been to all 4. We've done windshield surveys of everything. We have talked to 3 of the 4 communities. We're talking to places, so that will complete our feedback. We've gotten great feedback from everybody. In particular, Richard Slingerland from Terrytown has been very helpful and responsive. The others have been as well. We're also looking at the market demographics, and in looking at these 4 areas, we're comparing all kinds of factors. We felt that it was important to look just beyond who's there, what the retail is, and what the policies are, to understand why each of these communities is different and how they compare to Chappaqua. So we're not doing a market study doing this, but we wanted to understand market demographics. So how does Mount Kisco and the population around it drive the retail there versus Chappaqua? So we're looking at all 4 communities as well as Chappaqua. Physical attributes, types of stores, vacancy issues, history of how they got there today, what kinds of stores, store sizes. I know you don't want chains, but some of these communities having a mix is attracting people from a larger area. So, not necessarily all chains, but some with a recognizable, like someone mentioned, Soul Cycle. That's a recognizable, it's a chain, but it's recognizable. So it might be people from a larger area. Looking at parking issues, how it's treated, recreation, proximity to transit. Armonk is the only town that doesn't have proximity. They go to White Plains to get the train, but it's interesting that they've been successful for other reasons. Proximity of residential and types of residential and other attractions and demand drivers. What events are being held there? What are the anchors that are drawing people from outside the immediate community? Are there employers? Is there a mix of commercial and residential? So we're looking at all of that in order to be able to compare and identify potential strategies for Chappaqua. And as I said, we've talked to Terrytown, Mount Kisco, and Armonk, and we have a scheduled interview with Pleasantville this afternoon. So we're close to finishing this up, and we're going to provide a summary report draft, I guess, Bonnie, to you initially before the 4th. Or will we
Okay.
interview that to the? We just need to.
Yeah, I'll send those first.
Okay. All right.
Bob Kirkwood just joined us as well.
I have a question. Interject on the
Hey, hang on a
Hearing this
second.
on air?
Okay, we have a question over here.
For to get a summary, the intention is to create a summary of the existing conditions for the amount of retail presently, as well as will it summarize the types of that retail and an idea of the population that would be needed to support the existing retail?
We're looking at, you're talking about in the other 4 communities,
No,
right?
in Chappaqua.
Or are you talking about Chappaqua?
Chappaqua.
Okay, so,
Chappaqua.
yeah, we would look at the same attributes that we're looking in the 4 communities, and we are looking at that in Chappaqua. Who's here? What are the vacancies? What kinds of stores are here? And we're trying to understand the history as well of what's happened over time in getting to where you are today, because that's important. A lot of the impact in all the communities has been from online shopping. So you see a total change in the mix of uses that are in these communities and anywhere, because they have to compete with online shopping and what's going to attract people to these communities. So yes, we're looking at the mix of stores, who's here, who's not, and by looking at other communities and our experience in other places, we're going to recommend types of retail that you might want to consider attracting. So a lot of that is, when are you going to be doing that? At what point in time? Aren't a lot of vacancies right now? These other communities, the responsibility for that is really the landowners, building owners, and the brokers. They're the ones who have been bringing in the different retailers.
And you will let us know how many residential units are in downtown Chappaqua right now? Is that something you could do for us?
Bruce, do we have that information?
That's not something we have specified at this point, no.
It might be in one of the reports that's been done. A market demand analysis was done by HRNA.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it is in there. And to some degree, it will be in those prior reports, yes.
I don't know to what extent, what those boundaries are of that study. It might be, I don't
Right.
know what you're
Exactly.
thinking about. Maybe you're thinking about actually within the Hamlet area.
Yes.
I'm not sure
Right.
that it's that fine a grained study from HRNA. It might have been a bigger market area. It had to do with Whole Foods and all that other, big stuff that's up at Chappaqua Crossing.
Right.
Yeah, they were given both
But
HRNA and the KRF to analysis.
Right.
Do they have housing?
Right, the
They-
idea was rather than repeat a market demand analysis.
I'm sorry, Sabrina?
That we would use theirs as the basis.
Right, and
Right.
just for everybody, let me just put everybody on the same page, if I may. HRNA did the Chappaqua Hamlet. They most specifically looked at the boundaries of the hamlet that we're talking about, as well as what they were planning up at Chappaqua Crossing. AKRF came back and did the same thing, so the capture area is similar. Our capture area for this analysis needs to consider, it's kind of the reverse effect. We need to consider what's going on at Chappaqua Crossing in relation to the hamlet, whereas at the time, Chappaqua Crossing had to be considered
Right,
in
so
the hamlet.
the question, oftentimes, unless I'm mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but oftentimes these capture numbers tend to deal in dollars rather than residences. Do we know if in the HRNA study there's an answer to this question, whether they actually indicate there how many residences are in the area or not?
I don't believe so.
Right,
I do
usually
not
it's
believe
dollars
so.
that they look at.
It was
capture
dollars, square footage,
Right.
use.
Right.
Right, yeah, they do a demand analysis based on spending.
Well, this is something that's, this
Right, and
information
so I want to distinguish what we're doing compared to what HRNA and AKRF has done. We're not going to be doing the same kind of spending analysis where it isolates the specific populations in different areas and spending is associated with those populations. What we're looking for is more of a the comparison to these 4 specific communities and identifying what types of things have helped them succeed and what might work here. It's less, I don't want to say scientific because there's even in the other studies, there are not often as scientific as they kind of appear to be. And this is going to be more of a comparison of success in the other communities as it would relate to Chappaqua, Hamlet area near the train station.
Yeah, ours is more strategic, theirs was more analytical.
right.
And we can use that data. I don't think it has changed that much, but we can use that data as a reference.
Does the output?
It also relates to a lot more than just housing units and retail. It relates to other types of demand generators like daytime population and employment and the different events and things like that.
Ivy?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I heard, Patty, I heard you say that the output of this is a series of recommendations to us about the types of retail we might want to attract. There's also a housing component to this too, correct? So there's also a recommendation that's around the optimal number of housing units? Question mark.
That was not part of what we were asked to do.
So you're only looking at retail?
We're looking at retail and we're looking at the market factors for residential. So when the form-based code is completed, we can do a financial feasibility test.
You used a lot of industry terms there that I don't know.
Demand for residential. That wasn't something we were asked to do.
Well, I think the question is, how many residential units would support a certain amount of retail?
I think we had that information in the last
Right.
presentation.
Yeah.
Again,
Did we have that?
yeah, that's not the approach that we're taking on this. There's not we're not going to be equating a specific square footage of retail to a specific population size or income amount. This is going to be less mathematical in that respect and more relating to the strategy involved in generating demand for retail space. And in terms of the residential, it will be based more on the guidelines put forth by the plan that assume certain development in areas. We're not going to be looking at the financial capability for the entire plan. We'll be looking at the initial, most likely, I would think, the initial development parcel.
Yeah, one of the things I think is key here is that the focus is really on the hamlet, basically the boundary of the form-based code.
Right.
When you take a look at like the number of units to support an amount of retail, that's really a study that looks at a much bigger catchment area than just this small area.
Right.
Right, because it's not just number of units. It's what HRNA and AKRF did. It's an analysis of how much people spend or would spend and how much you can capture.
Yeah, it's about the capture area. So
Yeah.
if I may, at the last discussion, you guys showed a chart, Eric, specifically in your presentation as to how much residential versus what it would take for the uses. Let's leave it there. Let's let Rest Group finish their analysis to get to a point. We can question more after we kind of have some real material to feed back to. Let's move on today so we can get through some of this information.
Yeah, so do you want to go to the next steps, Patty?
Sure. So the next steps for the market plan will be to summarize our findings for the market and in terms of rent, units, unit sizes, operating expenses, so that we can test the code that you come up with.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to summarize everything we've just talked about for the four communities, the lessons learned, and come up with some strategies that we think could be used to differentiate Chappaqua from some of the surrounding communities to try and attract people from the region as well as the residential community that surrounds us. And then we're going to complete that testing of the code using this market financial information that we've put together. And that's going to be based on, I think Bruce was saying, the most logical is to look at the first phase of what this would be, because to project later on when something will be built, the assumptions become almost not useful because they're just assumptions. So I think if we test what would be the first phase, that makes the most sense.
All right, we have a question, Patty.
Hi, Patty. You mentioned rents in the other towns. Would it be possible to also obtain rents from the current Chappaqua landlords, or is that out of the scope?
We've been trying to obtain rent. Bruce has been calling brokers. We've been talking to property owners, and unfortunately with retail, residential is easier, but retail in particular, there's not a database that exists for each community. So it's really based on our interviews. So yes, to answer you, we're getting information for Chappaqua and the other communities. So.
All right,
Yeah,
folks.
we've been able to collect reasonable information on market rents for retail space downtown, particularly, the associated with the majority of the types of space, which is these smaller spaces. But, even in terms of the residential, the difficulty is that, the type of residential we kind of envision doesn't exist downtown right now. So, and that's another reason why we are also looking at some of these competing communities, because it does exist more often there than in Chappaqua.
Yeah, like Armonk Square, that was just built. I mean, that is a great range of what Chappaqua, the Hamlet, would be as far as rents. So.
Yes, and they are all one bedrooms and 100% rented.
Yeah. Yep.
I think it's interesting. They're all
I think there are some condominiums in there as well.
That's,
All right,
that sounds
might be, but
surprising.
yesterday. Okay.
I mean, I can't
Yeah.
imagine this.
All right, if I may, I'm gonna push you forward because my goal is to get us out of here on time and to get through the agenda.
Yeah, so the workshop number one that we had, I think it was a really great discussion. I think it surfaced a lot of things that clearly the community's been thinking about for some time. So in a summary here, the feedback that we heard is really summarized on this one slide, and then some additional comments on the next slide. So the biggest comment that people had was about building a new community center with pool, sports, meeting room, fitness center, senior center, and then there was one comment that was similar except without the fitness. So really there were seven people that made this comment. So that's certainly something that we need to take into account as a potential. There were a number of other ones. There was a walking track around the streams and ball fields, and there were some specific things about an ice rink, restaurants facing the ball field, the marquee playground, the town square with perimeter dining, relocating the community center to provide vehicular access, housing to tie into the train station, demanding maximum value if the land is, if the parking lots are developed, pedestrian connectivity, and moving town hall to Chappaqua Station. So on private land, the recommendations were an ice cream parlor at the north end, a boutique restaurant, full cycle type of facility, beer hall and concert space, incentivizing current landowners, a high-volume restaurant, and incentivizing landowners to consolidate and redevelop. So these were the comments that we received, and again, the biggest thing that we heard was really about this potential community center.
Eric, let me make one correction on number 14 in that slide. It's Chappaqua Crossing, not Chappaqua Station.
Got it. Yes. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I just noticed that too.
So there were some other comments that I think all of these will be addressed in this presentation, I believe, but I'll highlight them. One of them is that the location of facilities is critical to success. We couldn't agree more. There was a concern about not orphaning the existing merchants. Residential parking garages to be right-sized and located to complete the overall fabric of the hamlet. Also, there's a question about the scope of the project, which is, the scope was envisioned as being rezoning, streamlining, design and streetscape standards, incentives for current property owners, ensuring future development aligns with community vision, an examination of the current mix, and new spaces to meet community needs. So what I would say is yes to all of these, and so we're kind of going through this process. The question of what's going to help the existing merchants, scenarios appear to shift the town center was a comment. What's the guidance for what can be successful here? Competition, market realities, need, demand, and I think we talked about that in the previous slides that we're going through in this process. There was a comment that there was a previous plan to add a second bridge to the west, and then there was a comment about 4 to 5 story buildings should be permitted on North Greeley, and that there should be a strategic marketing plan. So all great comments. And again, I think we'll address almost all of these today. So when we talk about placemaking, really about the land use, the architecture, the public realm, and the programming, one of the things that we look at is the land use. This is a very simplified, generalized land use map. It takes a look and it shows these are the areas in commercial, which are red, the civic, which is in blue, the single family in yellow, which there's very few here, multi-family in the brown. There are some of those here, or a little bit, and a few townhouses. Then, of course, there's a lot of surface parking, which is in the gray. There is some open space, and there's some planned open space. So what our proposal and our recommendation is that residential should be permitted anywhere in this area, but there's no area where it should be restricted. Having said that, we believe that requiring commercial in key locations on the ground floor should be something that we are doing. However, the one thing we want to be very wary of is that you don't require commercial on the ground floor of everything. That's really important. Even in larger cities, you don't find that. So anytime that some jurisdiction has sort of attempted to do that, it becomes a problem because that's just way more retail than anybody can support. We do think that you should permit commercial in certain additional areas, but again, it's not required. They could be there. But there are areas that we may say you probably should not permit commercial in this area. And that's really about when you get really far. Think about to the south of this area. But we'll get to that in more detail. So based on our conversations at our last meeting and based on what we see in the goals of the comp plan, when it comes to architecture, what we recommend is that per the comp plan, that you have greater density that's permitted near the station and lesser as you get further away, that you permit up to 5-story buildings close to the station. We recommend a max of 4 stories along Greeley and a max of 3 stories along King, north of Greeley, and up to 4 stories at Bedford and King. So the rationale for this is multifold, right? So there's what's appropriate physically from kind of a visual perspective. There's also a consideration of what's there existing, what's the kind of character and the image that you want to present overall, the transition to single-family homes at the edges, And also considerations about balancing that with actual property sizes. In other words, when you travel up the hill on King Street, the depth of those lots is pretty shallow. So even if somebody were saying, gee, I'd like to be permitted to do 5-story, you're probably never going to be able to do that just because you couldn't get enough cars on that site. And you don't have a big enough parcel of land. So we're kind of balancing all those different things. We will also, in the end, this is preliminary because we're going to test some of this. RES Group is going to test this to sort of look at the building height, make sure it seems to make sense. But that's kind of the preliminary strategy. We also recommend that there's traditional architecture or traditionally inspired architecture only, with the exception of civic buildings. So, for example, if you were to do a new community center, that might be a place where you might allow more contemporary architecture. We do think that even with some of the larger buildings that you could get, that requiring a kind of picturesque massing and breaking down of the building is really important to maintain the character and the goals of the comp plan. So in the images that you see here on the right, you see 4-story buildings, for example. This is actually one single building. This is a retail building on the ground floor and rental units above. It's one building, but it's designed to look like multiple buildings, and it's broken up. Same thing with the bottom right one. This is the one that we looked at, Lubeck Square. I think that was the name of it. That everybody looked at and said, yeah, that would be okay. It's a 5-story building, but the massing breaks up the building. And this is an example of kind of a contemporary physical fitness community center. So would like to hear anybody's reaction to this.
I think that the idea of doing 5 stories, even close to the train station, is something that's going to be very contentious in this town. And I think that if we are going to move forward with it, we're going to need a good rationale and good data to support that.
I would also make the suggestion that, I know we saw it last time, but our comp plan talks about that word, Eric, that we talked about last time, that's bucolic. And I think one of the unique aspects of Chappaqua is the entrance from the train station, getting off the train, going to the train station. That green space, I think, is really important. It sets a tone, it's a welcome. And I'm not so sure that building that conventional cluster of housing right at the train station, which I understand cities do, etc., I think that really takes away from something that distinguishes us. And I'm not so sure that building residential there, which is a little bit further away from the commercial area, is what we want or what we would like to see. Personally, I think it's a bad direction. So I'd rather see more along North King, North Greeley, and King rather than do that.
I'd like to.
Hey Bob, I just wanted to say, this is Bonnie. I think we're going to address some of that in the future slides, and I think that you'll see that we agree with you about the nature of the park in front of the train station and the open space. And I hear what you're saying, but I think Eric has some options to present you with some rationale behind it that I think once we get through the presentation, we can continue.
Good. Last time we saw sketches, though, that that were put up there that basically parallel the circle and basically fill the circle with buildings.
Yeah, and I'm not so, I'm just, this is Tom Curley, I agree wholeheartedly with what Ivy said, and I think we'll come back to that after you show us some more stuff. And I agree with Bob, and I'm just not so sure that preserving that semicircle of green and then wrapping it with 5-story buildings necessarily keeps the bucolic nature. I think that's part of your point.
So let's get through the slides, because I think that they have information now that they didn't necessarily have before. Let's kind of hold the thoughts right now.
They asked us for
Why don't we take notes and then see what they have to say, rather than jumping the gun when we haven't even seen the presentation.
Play along.
I think I welcome the comments because I think it does sort of express some of the concerns and some of the concerns that I would have guessed that you would have. And so I think that as we go through, we'll do 2 things. One of them is we'll kind of finish the presentation and the rationale, and we'll talk about that, because I do think we can actually make that green better than it is today. But then we'll also come back and sort of look at the financial testing to sort of say, well, could this deal work as a 4?
So Eric, I propose that we just, instead of talking about what you're gonna show us, just show us so we can keep going here.
Sure.
Thank you.
So for programming, we kind of looked at, and we talked about this last time, you saw the chart on the left. These are preliminary recommendations. As Patty continues to do, as RES group continues to do their kind of study, we'll refine this. But certainly some of the preliminary recommendations are like the new comp plan, the Performance Business Improvement District, consider a downtown manager, increase marketing, creating a public space for existing and new activities. This is something that's really interesting in communities. We often think about economic development and we think about buildings and we think about office and retail and residential. But in reality, communities are finding that public spaces can actually be an economic development engine. When you look at surrounding communities, for example, you find very few that actually have a kind of dedicated public open space that becomes a destination, which is often what people are looking for, someplace to go and be and visit and see other people. The specific programming that consider some ideas that we have right now are live work art gallery building in an existing structure, could be the firehouse, might need to be subsidized, farm to table culinary center, a STEM education center, a privately owned food hall, for example, could be the Rite Aid building, a water feature, winter ice skating, outdoor yoga, food events, holiday light stroll on Main Street, and then, of course, the comment from many of you, which was the community center, the swim club, the wellness center. So for the public realm, we recommend the creation of a signature space that accommodates existing and new programming and scheduled events. It should have active uses at the perimeter. When we've gone out and we've studied the success of different spaces, a lot of it has to do with what's immediately around that space. So, for example, when we're talking about the historic half circle in front of the train station, it's unfortunate that it's surrounded by parking lots. It doesn't provide kind of a wonderful setting for that. That it should have sun, shade, water, food, places to sit, and people. These are the key kind of ingredients to make it a successful build. That it should have stronger walkable connections, meaning how you get there, what the arrival experience is, and whether it's integrated with the downtown is really important. But also creating a kind of set of secondary spaces that become minor anchors within the community. And then augmenting the character of the ball field with surrounding uses. So when we look at the street network, certainly we've heard that there's some traffic issues and congestion that happens there. And I think somebody was going to talk about this, John, right?
John, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes.
It was on mute. Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, good.
We can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, sorry. So basically you have two parking on both sides of the entrance to the south parking lot off of, I guess that's Pleasantville Road, goes into Pleasantville anyway.
It's
The road
Washington
is wide
Avenue.
enough- okay, thank you. The road is wide enough to accommodate two-way traffic if you eliminate 4 parking spaces. And so if you do that, you can have people from the south end of the community come in here and not go up through the congested Greeley intersection with the train station. You'd also have to lose or reconfigure a couple of spaces further in. There's some angled spaces there. You'd turn 4 spaces into 2 parallel ones to accommodate that. And you could be somewhat creative if you wanted to allow people to go further up into the north parking lot there and make it more effective. You could do one of two things. You could either eliminate the 4 parking spaces there, or you could put up signs that would allow northbound flow from 4 a.m. to 11 a.m. and then southbound flow out of there from 11 a.m. to 4 a.m. I got the numbers wrong on that, but basically I've seen that done in several places, and it's pretty effective. So that would basically allow you to get into that parking lot in the morning without having to go up into town. Then up at the north end, and we have a follow-on slide that will show the benefits, but at the north end where you come down King Street and you can go into the parking lot and you have the stores, Mrs. Greeley is on the right there, and you have the stores along the north side and angled parking. If you have parallel parking, you'll lose 8 spaces, but you'll make it wide enough to accommodate two-way traffic, so you can have inbound and outbound traffic. Because it's a street, I wouldn't recommend making it sort of inbound in the morning and outbound in the afternoon, like I had done internal to the parking lot. So the benefits of this would be, and this is sort of consistent with the comp plan, which is to improve traffic operating conditions and provide flexibility in the downtown, would be, particularly in the morning when you're coming in from the south end of the community, instead of the green line shows going up and into the busy intersection, so you would take traffic off of that, and instead you would put it in at the south end, where in the morning there's not that many people coming out anyway, so it would be pretty effective. You would have a very modest benefit at the north end. The few people that wanted to go out towards King Street wouldn't have to go out the main intersection. They could just go under the Quaker Road Bridge and take a right turn and go out that way. In the afternoon, the benefits of that connection would be more substantial, obviously, because that's when the trains come in and you have a lot of people leaving the parking. So instead of having to go out the busy intersection and deal with the triangle, yielding to make a left onto it and then yielding to make a left off of it, you could go under Quaker Road and then you could come out at King Street, make a left, go straight, or make a right and a right. So those were some recommendations that would improve traffic operations in the downtown area.
John, we have a question here.
Hi, John.
Sure.
On the Lower King slide, you said you wouldn't recommend like certain times for did you say that it should be two-way versus?
No, that it should be two-way all the time. That
Right,
you
that's,
would-
but I wanted to understand why that is.
Because it's a street that would be active.
As opposed to a parking lot.
It's a busy four-way intersection, so where I recommended it at the parking lot, it's basically just a two-way bridge, and there's not a lot of, there's no commercial activity. There will be some pedestrian activity, but it's not as busy as a four-way intersection in the downtown.
And may I ask, have you ever seen streets that have implemented that, like that have had certain times where it was two-way versus not?
There is a Pleasant
Yeah,
by the
I think there was one in Mamaroneck, by the French American School.
Okay.
And I've also seen it associated in certain circumstances with houses of worship. In those instances, it's really a Sunday issue.
Okay. But I
Yeah,
guess.
but I think that in general, we typically would rather opt for two-way traffic at all times. It just simply provides more distribution of traffic, and it creates a better pedestrian environment as well. There's so many cities and towns that have, for example, one-way streets that are now trying to push to go back to two-way streets.
So I just want to give you a little piece of feedback, John, which is that at least for those of us on my side of the table right now, we're having a little trouble following along with some of the discussion you just had about the changes in the traffic patterns at certain times of the day. So I don't think anybody's jumping up and down about it right now, but when you're here in person next time, it would definitely be helpful to go through this with a pointer so that you could be pointing out where you're...
Just go over one more time.
Can you use a pointer or something?
Relatively simple. Go ahead.
Hi, John.
Okay, so right now at Washington Avenue,
Can you go to that
one-way
slide?
southbound.
John, without a pointer, it's kind of hard for us to follow you.
Oh, there's the mouse.
Oh, there's the mouse,
Perfect.
okay,
Thank
perfect,
you.
much better.
Okay.
Yeah. So right now, the driveway coming out of the parking lot on Washington Avenue, if you can go to that right there, right? That's one-way southbound, so you can't go in there in the morning. Right? Anybody who's coming from the south end of the community has to go up past the library, past the school to this really busy intersection, turn in here, and then make their way to the parking lot. So if we could take all of those cars off of that busy intersection and instead route them down Washington Avenue and put them into the parking lot in that direction, either into the lower parking lot or even into the north parking lot, that's an improvement. And the way you can do that is at the south end of the south parking lot, there's right there's parking on both sides of the driveway there, which means it's only wide enough for one lane of travel. So if you can go back 2 slides.
John, just some feedback on that. There are very few people who are coming from the south side of town.
Yeah,
We are almost in the south corner. I mean, I would start to go that way,
But
and I think maybe
if
you
you go
would too,
past
but
Julio
it's-
Bike Shop and come down, that's a great way to go.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great idea,
John,
but
would
it's not as though it's going to alleviate
John,
a great deal of traffic that comes from that way today, then gets to Pizza Station and makes a left. You know what I'm saying?
So
Coming straight on Washington.
So let's pause a second, because I think those are very good points. Let's talk about the King Greeley intersection, okay? Because part of this is, and I'm assuming, John, is that these changes work together.
No, they can work separately.
Okay. And then I have another follow-through question. In your diagram of turning what the Washington Avenue connection to the parking lots into two-way, are you, is there enough room to put sidewalks over there?
I would have to look into that, but there may be.
Along down
So
by
can you go
Washington.
back 2 slides?
That's, Washington Avenue is a
So-
problem
so-
with
so
Pleasantville,
to-
actually.
Not on,
In our parking lot.
Yeah.
In the parking lot.
So not along Washington Avenue.
That,
No.
whatever that road is there, yeah.
Right, so where
That's
the
where-
arrow is, just thinking about right now, the sidewalk doesn't start until you get to the bridge.
Correct.
You know, so thinking of maybe widening those end islands a little bit to put in some sort of
Because there's
pedestrian
two-way
path.
traffic, you don't wanna be walking.
Two-way, right.
Correct, and so that needs to be a consideration in understanding how many parking spaces that would affect.
Well,
Yeah, you want to make the
islands,
landscape islands green, or do you want to just make them sidewalks?
So are
Yeah.
we getting a little fine-grained at this moment on?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that,
Come back
I
to
think
that
that
later.
it's important to kind of highlight one of the reasons that we're going through this. It's certainly for the short term, for like what's happening today. I think these are great recommendations. I think that for the long term, for kind of the full build out, I think that this is really a critical thing. It really highlights, I think, when you look at this, that having two-way access down here, having two-way access up here, really makes everything much better. It allows better sort of pedestrian connectivity, allows traffic to sort of have multiple kind of routes in and out. I think it's just a better kind of approach to doing this.
I think to your point, Eric, I think it better connects the parking area and the commuter experience potentially to North Greeley and the shopping area up there, because if you have another way of going out, instead of just getting out of here, blowing out of this place, now you have the chance of actually going to a destination. So I like this, that it actually potentially ties in the commuter experience with the downtown. This is exactly what I think the shopkeepers and merchants need.
And to Ivy's point, that most of the people going to the train station are coming from the north rather than the south right now. I can understand that because that's where most of the people live. But if you give them the opportunity to bypass going into town and come around down 117 and come around to the south, I imagine they'd be doing that in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
There's
whole,
no reason for them to do it
east
now.
side of town.
Yeah.
Do that.
Yeah, it's much more concise and leaves the business areas open for business.
Yeah,
But you should,
absolutely. So it isn't just about getting in and out of a parking lot and controlling movement.
No, it's
Eric?
circulation, right.
you should know though that we have a lot of pushback from merchants on Lower King Street that they don't want that street two-way. Cause they're concerned that no one will.
Understood, and I think that's really kind of a parking issue.
Right.
If we could hold that thought,
Okay,
let's kind of go through the bigger picture.
yeah.
So when we look at the framework, one of the things we're really trying to do is establish a framework. And so when we went back, we had a meeting afterwards with the Historical Society. I absolutely love going back and studying historic documents and plans. what I find that often is that there was actually a vision that made a lot of sense, and people came back and they demolished it later, or it never got fully implemented. So that's something we found here. But when we look at the historic buildings and sites, let's just start with that. A couple of things that we found, we certainly, you know about the Greeley House, right? There's a national and local landmark. Also, and I forget the name, what was it, Tim?
Greeley Grove, the woods.
Yeah, the Greeley Grove over here associated with the church, and then some other buildings as well. So these are buildings that are on the National Local Landmark. Our local landmarks are eligible for landmark status. One of the things that specifically that we found, though, was that here at the station, what you see colored in purple, this was the donation for the station and also for the park itself. So the park itself at one time was not, I'll say, in the condition that the Greeleys were happy with, and they kind of went and they changed the design to really be what you see today, which is the small green and the parking around it. However, this zone that you see in the purple is actually written into the deed that it has to be maintained as this public space. And so when we look out at that today, you look at it and you say, well, really, the parking? The intention was always that the space would actually be bigger. It just wasn't being maintained. But I think that memorial really certainly is a historic element and a landmark, both national and local landmark, that we need to respect. And I think we could actually highlight and make better. So the other thing that we found, when you kind of go back to the 1893 map, the original station, what we're looking at here, this is actually King Street, and it used to cross the tracks. And that's actually the reason why today you see those buildings, that sort of more consolidated buildings on King Street, right before you get to the tracks. And that's because the street used to go through and connect the community east to west on the tracks. Mm-hmm. That's not the case today. But the station used to actually be up to the north. And then, of course, when the Greeleys donated land, that station moved to the south over here. At that same time, the connection across the tracks went away. And so there was actually a vision for what that is. So if we look at the Hopkins 1930 map, you actually see what the idea and the plan was for downtown Chappaqua. So a new bridge was built over the tracks. King Street came down, and rather than crossing the tracks, it actually turned here, going south, leading you to the train station. There was the A.H. Smith Memorial Park. And then all of this area that we today see as surface parking lots was actually platted and planned to be residential and commercial.
Wow.
So when you look at this, there was actually a vision for this being a downtown that incorporates multiple blocks. 1, 2, 3, the park 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It was a number of blocks. It was a walkable downtown, and it all linked to the train station and to the Memorial Park. Wow. Really becoming a focus here at the station and the park, but really also, again, just being a multi-block kind of downtown.
What? Get that. Isn't
that funny?
So the key, I think, here is it was downtown blocks versus kind of a single street. So I found this historically very fascinating, but I also look at it and I say, yeah, this was the right thing to do. This was a good plan. Of course, what happened in the advent of the car is a lot of plans and a lot of downtowns and cities, people came back and they tore down all the businesses out of downtown and they filled it with parking lots. And then now we're sort of going back and trying to fill it all back in with buildings instead, because we saw what happens when you just fill things with parking lots. You kind of lose the character and the quality. The commercial and the towns and the cities all kind of suffer from that. And so we're going back and trying to create these experiential environments that people want to be in.
Okay.
So when we look at the existing framework, we're sort of understanding, so where are we today? So right now, the station and the park are isolated. They're really separated by the parking lots. Nobody really says to themselves, boy, I'd really like to take a walk through a parking lot. The civic node to the south is also isolated. Again, partly because of the parking lots, but they're kind of, further away. There's a weak connection to the hilltop. You do get some of the homes here that have become commercial, but then you get kind of a break, and part of that is also just the physical character of it. It's the hill, there's also smaller buildings with gaps between, there's a few driveways, but there's kind of a weak connection there. And the experiential environment, the reason people go to downtowns is they're looking for that experience of the buildings on both sides and the intensity of the activity. It's pretty limited. It really exists only at this intersection. Yep. And then it kind of peters out as you go to the north, it ends as you go to the south. So it's not really that strong. So when we take a look at a framework and we say, well, what would a stronger framework look like? We say, well, a stronger framework might look like this, where you in essence have a stronger connection on Greeley. There's an anchor to the north, probably not going to be as significant of an anchor as the Memorial Park. That you have a Memorial Park that rather than sitting in the middle of a parking lot and being really small, it is kind of small, you could actually make that bigger and you could actually have uses around it. And that you create a network of streets that allows you to have a place to walk. So one of the things that we look at when people go somewhere to a downtown or something, is they're really looking for a place to kind of walk and have an experience, or in other words, kind of a loop. In other words, you can imagine yourself, you park once, you go out here, you walk down the street, and then you sort of have an experience that leads you into the park, it takes you up, it takes you back under the bridge, it takes you over, and it has a series of things that you can actually do, a series of events. You have the cross street Main Street, you have the public space, you move back through, there's another anchor up here, or you make your way down here, there's the civic anchor down here, and you make your way up the hill as well. So we think that this is a much stronger framework and a way of kind of envisioning and looking at this. The other thing then becomes that you really need to sort of fill these in. You need to fill in these kind of empty spaces so that there's actually a reason to sort of follow the streets and follow the walk. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
If I could interject and just ask the folks other than the consultants who are on the phone to let us know who's there for the attendance record.
Greg's here.
Hi, Greg. Okay, thank you.
So then from this proposed framework, let's actually see what that looks like. So we're going to look at, these are kind of hypothetical implementations. So let me highlight that. So we're sort of drawing something that sort of says, this is how it could develop. It's obviously not going to be the way that it is going to develop, but we need to understand what the potential is in order to codify it, in order to understand the full build-out scenario, and in order to kind of go through the secret process. We want to make sure that we're incorporating the potential things that could be there. So we're going to look at 3 scenarios. All 3 of them use the same framework that we just presented. Oops, sorry. They all accommodate a potential new community and recreation center. We're not deciding what the disposition of public lands are today. Rather, we're establishing a street, block, and open space framework that serves as a basis for the regulating plan. The potential build-out and density does need to be determined for the form-based code standards, the build analysis, and the EIS. And so that's kind of why we're kind of going through this process. So Tim's going to walk us through the 3 scenarios here.
Yeah, so starting at scenario 1, we can begin looking at the south. I think after our last meeting, we had a lot of discussion, a lot of feedback, where people were very interested in improving the town hall site and adding a recreation center. So that is a central part of all 3 of these scenarios we're going to be going through. So the way this possible way that could get built, this looks at building a new town hall up closer to the street on a small civic space to create a relationship with the library and the town hall, to create this gateway to Chappaqua as you're arriving from the south, and then looks at locating a wellness center on the site next to it. This is still the playground that is currently planned to be improved. This is showing the basketball courts that are planned. In this scenario, the basketball courts have actually been moved over a little bit, so this is not exactly where they are currently planned today. But since they have not yet been built, we thought one of the scenarios or two of the scenarios might keep them but slightly relocate them. So what these two buildings do then is really set up this strong civic node at the south end of site. They create a relationship between them, and also equally important, they create a relationship across the stream onto the large public space here. We had heard some feedback from the group that this space was very important to remain, although it might not necessarily remain as a baseball field or softball field, but could be reconfigured into a multi-use space. Obviously, it could stay as an operational and functional softball field. So the fact that we're showing this as a new multi-use public gathering space doesn't necessarily mean that it can't stay as in its current form as a baseball stadium. But what this does is these buildings create a space that create a relationship that really shape the space of the large active recreation multi-use gathering space. There's the existing gazebo. It also adds a walking network along the stream that surrounds the open space and connects back to Greeley Avenue. Other things we would recommend in the code would be improvement of the streetscape to really strengthen the pedestrian connection as you're heading north back into the downtown. Right now you are a little separated because of the large setbacks of the school and the green space, and it certainly is beautiful to look at the green space, but having a pedestrian connection that has maybe a little more interest as you're walking past it to strengthen that connection.
The other thing is that when we talk about the connection to the north, it is a big gap, right? But having buildings which actually line the edge here actually makes this feel shorter. So, for example, if I'm standing here and this is framed by these buildings over here, it feels much more connected.
So if you can, Tim, kind of enlighten me a little bit. When you talk about the pedestrian connection in front of the school and next to rec field, we have brand new sidewalks that are in there, street trees that have been planted. What more are you referring to as far as that pedestrian connection in that area specifically?
Motorized walkways.
Well, I think that one of the things we're recommending is the building siting. So, for example, when you're walking along here, if you actually can see buildings that are framing this space, it feels closer and it feels occupied. And so I think that's a significant kind of visual improvement that feels like you have greater connectivity. I would add to that. I would say you're right that there are streetscape improvements taking place. So my words may have been poorly chosen. This is about the pedestrian connection from an experiential sense, that you are always seeing something. You never feel like you're isolated. You're seeing the buildings, you're seeing the downtown, you're seeing the space, you're seeing the new civic building to the south. So it's more of a spatial orientation connection, because I think the current streetscape improvements are going to do a lot to help that. But more than that is creating the buildings that frame the spaces to make you so that you always have a sense of where you are within the downtown with recognizable landmarks like a new town hall, a community center, and the downtown.
So can I make a recommendation here? I think these will each scenario. We'll learn more about each one if we sort of go through all of them, and then we can compare them and talk about them that way. But I do have one specific question about the parking garage down here. Is that to serve the displaced parking? And is it also to serve for the wellness center? And that must be a town-built garage, correct?
Yeah, you are very perceptive. That was exactly what I was going to talk about next. Yes, so by both displacing the parking that exists and also adding new uses, you need to make that up somewhere. So this parking deck that's shown here serves to provide parking for the town hall, for the wellness center, and the displaced parking that comes from redeveloping the town hall site.
Okay.
So this is about 218 cars, roughly, that would be required to park the new program, to park the existing town hall, and replace what was lost.
Got it. Thanks.
And in this scenario, it's a one-level deck, meaning it's still asphalt on the ground, and there's one level above it.
Got it. Thank you.
So yeah, we'll go through the other scenarios as well, but just moving up to the top, there was also comments about, well, what's happening as an anchor at the north end of the site? Up at the north end of the site, this is all privately owned land, so putting a city or a civic use up there is probably not appropriate for us to recommend. So what we are saying, though, is that right at this point, there's such a narrow piece of land between North Greeley and the train track right-of-way that it would be appropriate. It's not really developable with buildings, so having a small green space there could be a really good use for that. There is some possibility for new multifamily housing to develop on this parcel with a little bit of retail, and in this version we're showing the Rite Aid building remaining. We had talked earlier about using it as a public food hall, a privately owned food hall with a lot of vendors. And actually having this relationship to an open space is great. People want to come there and eat, and then you want to sit down at a table in a park to enjoy your food. The other thing that we could envision this as is there has been the chap line running to the north that is being studied. Right. And I have found, studying other cities and in personal experience, combining active recreation and food and beverage uses seems to go together really well. In the town where I live, every weekend there are large groups of cyclists that come by, and they all show up at the coffee shop or the beer hall or the food hall, and you get your food, relax before you move on. So this could be thought of as a symbolic trailhead to the chap line, which then would continue to run further to the north. Other things here we're showing, we showed this last time, but it's worth repeating, the possibility to add a single level deck over the existing town-owned parking lot here. There's, in order to reinforce the framework of creating a walkable connection from King Street into Allen Place, leading you back towards the train station, creating some small liner buildings on a parking deck behind it would both increase the parking supply for existing businesses and also provide some additional parking for new development, which could really improve this connection if you're trying to look at a network of walking downtown that has multiple ways to get you to the train station.
When you say the small liner buildings, could that have like a small commercial, small retail space in that liner building?
Yeah, it could. I think it's a pretty narrow site. So what you might imagine is it could be like a live-work type building where you have a very small ground floor commercial, and then your residence is above it. If there are some small professional services or small shops that would want to locate in a place like that, it could be really great. We would not say that it's required to have a retail ground floor or a commercial ground floor. That would, improve the pedestrian experience. But if it just ends up being a live-work building that has more living than working, that is also fine if that's the way it ends up getting built.
And Tim, let's talk about that parking area across from Susan Lawrence. That's a prime piece of real estate right there. You think just a one-story parking structure should be put there? Or can we do some multifamily with the parking in the rear, and so forth?
I'd like to just to tie onto that, not to interrupt, but also make the observation that's a small lot, and as is the one you have drawn near the bridge, and that as a parking deck structure, that's got to be hugely inefficient and expensive per space. I just don't see it realistic as a structure anybody would want to take on. Myself, just financially, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think that when we look at that as town-owned property, it's the kind of thing where you might enter at a high elevation so that it is really small. Let me start there. But you could do a single level deck where you actually enter at the higher elevation so you don't actually have a ramp in there. So why would the town want to do that? Well, when you look across the street, there's a building here at Sarah Lawrence, right? If you were to build residential units there, or let's say, you took a couple lots here and you wanted to build residential. These lots are really, really small. So where are they going to park those units? Where are they going to park? Well, one option is that this becomes a town lot that allows people to actually then add on or redevelop some of these really small lots.
Well, if you're talking about a deck with no ramp of that size, I think that's your best shot at making it reasonable. But I don't know how you're going to get in there from the west, going through what is an area which already has residences in it and apartments up in there. I'm not sure you can actually get in there and have all that traffic go in there, but that's a detail, just something that would be of concern.
Yeah, but I think it does highlight one of the challenges in this area, is that, as a pedestrian, when you're standing there, it looks big, but when you think about what does it take to actually, put something in there and have enough parking for it and circulation and ramps, and these are really small areas. They're challenging.
So we have about a half hour left. Would it be prudent to get to scenario 2 now?
How many scenarios are
Yeah, let's get through the 3 scenarios.
Now let's just highlight 2 quick things.
Sure.
That's on the hill. There are a number of units here. There's some older historic homes.
Yeah.
They are not on the town landmark list. But what we're showing is the potential redevelopment of them. Again, the building height, the number of units, the parking strategy is really based on the kind of idea that there's small lots that's challenging to kind of combine them. But you would add residential. And then at the very top of the hill, it's probably not likely to redevelop anytime soon. However, for purposes of a kind of build-out analysis, we kind of looked at it and said, well, here's what could happen in that scenario. It would probably become much more residential, less retail. You could still have retail, but if you're looking at focusing and improving things for the retail down in downtown at the bottom of the hill, it would be better if there were less retail here competing with them. So that's all I would say about that scenario.
All right, so we'll move on to number 2. So again, the remainder of the plans don't really change, so we're just going to discuss what's going on around the train station. So in this version, or in this hypothetical scenario, we're looking at what if the wellness center was moved to be closer to the train station. This was another idea that was floated, and so we did an investigation of what that would mean. The other thing we're showing here is actually an expanded and restored A.H. Smith Memorial Park, as Eric previously mentioned, sort of the historic grant from the family to create a park there was actually much larger than what exists today. Over the years, this was filled in with parking. So this is sort of restoring the original vision of Greeley's daughter and the gift to the town to create land for the train station and an A.H. Smith Memorial Park. Putting the wellness center over by the train station also has some other interesting ramifications. One is, this lot is smaller, and we're showing development on it. But even if there weren't development on it, it's a small lot that doesn't provide a lot of parking, and in any case, the parking that would be there would need to be replaced. So this is where we're looking at showing a larger parking structure back towards the southwest. We'll get to that in a second, but looking at completing the idea of an expanded and improved A.H. Smith Memorial Park. So this has a civic use on it, which is great. It has then other active uses with mixed-use buildings that have a ground floor that increases pedestrian activity and increases vitality for the site, which we think is important. I know last time during the meeting there were some comments about, well, that's a lot of retail, and I think that's true. That's a true comment. I think what we're showing in red, it's important to think of as not necessarily retail in terms of shopping. It's generally commercial space, which could be restaurant space, or even a ground floor use that there was someone mentioned, like a farm-to-table culinary center. So these could be things that are not exactly retail, but still bring people and drive foot traffic and are experiences that would pull people down into the downtown area.
Although what I would say is that, you really shouldn't be afraid of some additional retail, because that's part of the reason people go to certain downtowns, is really because there's a lot going on. There's a lot there, a lot of choices. And so, having something really, really small makes it difficult for it to be attractive to a lot of people. So I do think that increasing it some is not something that anybody should be afraid of.
So then looking at the parking lot in the southwest, we're showing a large parking garage with some infill residential housing. I think the reasons for this there's a few of them. One, I think adding more people downtown sort of necessarily creates more downtown people, right? If someone already lives downtown, you don't have to entice them to come downtown. They're already there. And so this, drives additional foot traffic, creates some more vitality during all hours of the day, and meets comp-plan goals of increasing residential density and ridership for the train station. The other reason we would do this is because once you start developing, even if it's just the wellness center, the second you start touching the parking lot, you have to start replacing that parking. And you end up in a situation where you have to build a big garage anyway. And so if you're going to end up sort of having to build a large garage, it's better to surround it with other uses. One, to drive the residential program, but also so the experience of people that are coming into Chappaqua, either on foot, on bike, in their cars, that their vision of Chappaqua is not seeing a garage, it's seeing a much more friendly face, seeing residential buildings.
Do you have a sense of how big that parking garage is? How many stories is that parking garage?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I didn't hear the question. Can you repeat that, please?
Do you know approximately how many stories that parking garage would need to be to accommodate all of the spots that have been lost?
Yeah, so it would need to be about 5 stories.
Okay.
So it's a big garage to provide all the parking for the existing commuters, and also new parking for the wellness center, and then also parking for any additional development that you would want to come along with that.
One thing we may want to consider is how long does it take to get out of a 5-story parking garage? You probably don't have the answer now, but if we move forward with this and this is something that we're considering, it would be sort of interesting to understand if, 100 cars were trying to get out of this parking garage at the same time. I don't know if it's 100,
I think there are tons of examples that show this kind of a configuration, right, at a train station up in this area, really.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't
With-
doubt
with
that, I
white-
just
with
need
white-
information to have.
With White Plains, which I this is Rob Greenstein, I zip out of there all the time.
I think
And
I'm
it
looking
takes
at the
me,
White Plains
it takes me a lot.
yeah.
It takes me a lot less time than it does at the Chappaqua station. That's for sure.
Is that because the traffic flow on the local streets is better, though?
Well, I mean, with Chappaqua, we have basically two ways out, which lead to the same exact intersection. So, besides the sort of obvious problem with that, it just flows really nice. The parking lot in White Plains. I don't know the design. What I'm telling you is I get a ton of people get out of the train. We all walk to the train station. I walk to my car and I just zip out. I don't know where everybody goes, but I just zip out of the parking garage.
Well, I think that's a very good observation because I'm not quite sure if this is, getting down in the weeds, but, we talked about all those different kinds of flows that we might have out of the parking lot before with John. We look at this and I don't see any of those kinds of solutions, so we have this big structure. What happens for the flow coming out? It seems to me that we're gonna start to frustrate that northern exit flow or in different flows in and out. So, I mean, that's a detail, but I mean, to Rob's point, it's very important, and to Ivy's point, it's very important to have outlets from these buildings, from these structures.
Yeah.
And also, it ties in with the rest of the hamlet again. This again, it seems to me, is starting to segregate the parking experience from the downtown hamlet. And when you have this kind of attenuated parking, I don't see how it's gonna support the commercial network up to the north very, very satisfactorily.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, so I would say there are a couple of principles here, right? When you, kind of a conventional suburban development is you drive up and you park in front of the store and you walk in front of the store. What happens there is that people, if you're gonna go down another, 600 feet or something, they'll get in their car and they'll drive over to the next one and they'll park in front of that one. So in other words, it's all very much destination oriented in terms of the individual store. When you go to a downtown, it's different. You basically use a park one strategy where you park, then you walk, and then you go by multiple stores, which actually increases foot traffic and the likelihood of you visiting and being a patron in another town.
So Eric, we had that conversation. Eric, I'm sorry, we had that conversation last time, and I think we understand that principle pretty well. What I think doesn't work in this case is that the parking that you've got is so far away from the place where people are gonna wanna walk that they're just not gonna make that trip. They're gonna get in their car and they're gonna drive to another space up in the middle of the hamlet.
Can I just throw something out there?
Yeah, let me ask you a real key question here.
Sure.
My understanding is that this parking is transit parking.
Yes.
Yes. So where are people parking who are coming to your newly expanded civic sort of public sphere there around the train station? Or your wellness center? Where does your wellness center?
For here, for example, on this block,
yeah,
there's enough parking for these uses. In this block, there's enough parking for these uses.
Right. The other
There's
thing.
some single parking out in front here as well.
Okay.
So these uses are not parking over here.
Okay, and might I suggest something else that maybe you're not familiar with, which is we provide our merchants with 7 spots per store for their parking, so, for example, in the South Greeley parking lot, which is behind the stores, 1/3 to a half of the spots are taken up by merchants and their employees. If I can take and direct all of that parking into a farthest structure, because those guys are coming in the morning and opening all the street parking up to, customers, that's huge.
Much better, yeah.
Yeah, and just so you know, that was our assumption. For example, in this particular block, is that if you're adding any uses, then you're adding additional parking spaces. You're not taking away any parking spaces that are there today.
But if I can get the employees and the merchants out of those spots are all available for customers. And that's been a struggle here.
But the issue I have is we're contemplating 3, 4, 5-story structures, so we're going to be bringing more concentration, which is what we want. There has to be some sort of escape valve in place for these folks to park.
I appreciate the fact it doesn't resolve that issue as far as circulation when it comes to the train station and exiting, but
Sabrina,
Yeah.
give me the three.
And I do like the idea of residential or some sort of building around that lot, so you're not seeing it. So you're seeing maybe a 5-story residential structure with potentially something on the bottom, but you're not seeing the parking lot when you come in, which is.
So Eric, can you move on? Can we go to the next scenario, because as this one has incited more discussion, I think the next one will as well.
Yeah, so, this one,
3 total.
yeah, so this is the third one, and, yeah, we'll only talk about things that have changed. So this, goes back to having the town hall and the wellness center co-located on the site, on the park, and then looks at sort of what we would study as, a full build-out scenario with additional multifamily and ground floor uses surrounding A.H. Smith Memorial Park. Just some notes, right? These new buildings that we're showing park themselves, meaning the commercial uses and the residential uses are parking inside these buildings. So this big garage to the south is envisioned really only as commuter parking, and of course people that are living in the uses that surround it would have spaces in there as well. But so this is parking for only the uses that are down in this southern quadrant. Additionally, there would be parking for the.
A quick question. When you're talking about these blocks being self-parked, are you considering any shared parking, or are you parking it at, what each use needs and there's no share going on?
So we're using, I would
just gonna say, we're gonna talk about parking as well right after this, so ratio.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Right, so this, I think what this does is it gives you more residential units than the other scenarios. The other thing that it does is it actually lines units facing this park, really integrating this and making it feel like it's all a part of downtown, and making it feel much closer in that sense.
So can I,
and I think the other thing is that it activates this new green, which is a good size. I think it's about 0.9 acres, right? Which is a decent size. You can do a number of activities there. Becomes kind of a destination. And so if we look at all three of these, one of the things that we did is we said, well, if we ranked it 0, 1, 2, and 3 about how well does it achieve the goals of the comp plan, let's take a look at that. And so some of these things, I think they were kind of neutral, so we didn't score them. But in essence, when you look at the three scenarios, scenario 1, which really just really allows you some infill, some addition, a new community building, but not really developing those parking lots, we got a score of 18. When you look at scenario 2, which allows you to increase some residential and some commercial and enlarge the green, they've got a score of 56. And scenario 3, which allows you to have the most residential, gets you a score of 67. So I don't know that the exact numbers are so important as much as it is that scenario 3 is really helping you to meet the goals that have been stated in the comp plan.
Eric?
Much sort of robust and fuller way.
I didn't see in scenario 2 and scenario 3 about how many new residential units are you adding? Approximately, I know they can vary in size, but just to get an idea.
Let's see. You remember? I have to look up the numbers, but I'm trying to remember. It was adding maybe an additional 300 to 400 units, something like that. 300 units, maybe.
I thought it's.
I would have to go look at the drawing.
I thought it was 302. I thought it was 302 and 503. Those are the numbers I remember.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, these numbers are a little different than last time, but yeah, roughly. It's roughly about 250, 300.
I think that's the.
Okay.
In that range, right?
I want to make an overall comment if you
Yeah,
think it's an appropriate moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm frustrated that between 1, 2, and 3, there are certain pieces that are the same all the way through that I think need to be thought about differently, or at least explored differently. This may come from, and by the way, this is Bill Spade, from my experience as an architect. When I do different scenarios, I try to explore very different arrangements of everything between the three, and that's commonly what I do, and then go through with the client, what are the pieces of those three that we like, what don't we like, and then we put together another scenario. So I'm feeling frustrated that, for instance, the rec field, which could be thought of in different ways, is the same thing in all plans. Most pieces of the plans are the same all the way through. I'd love, here, just let me say, I would love us to have the chance to have a charrette session, a brainstorming session where we look at these scenarios, but also all have an open chance to say what our thoughts are about these pieces, and maybe through that session we come up with some more concurrence on what the various pieces of the overall plan could be.
Eric, if I could just interject, I think I'm echoing what Bill's saying in a different way. I only see one plan here with 3 density alternatives.
Yeah.
And
that's absolutely correct, and that's why I flipped back to the slide. So, and that's purposeful, because one of the things that I think we need to clarify here is that what we're doing is we're creating a code, and we're creating a regulating plan, which is the framework. So what will actually happen, for example, in this block, we don't know, because you don't own that land and other people own that land, right? So what we're doing with the regulating plan is saying, this is the street network, here are the form standards about the faces of these blocks, and other development standards, and the private sector is going to develop this in different ways. So we're not dictating this is exactly what's going to happen. So what we're shooting for is a common framework that can accommodate 30 different scenarios. But what is important in that framework is that we lock in certain specific things.
Right.
So those are the streets, those are the blocks, those are the public elements, right? So if you're going to create a public green space, then that's the kind of thing that we want to lock in now, versus kind of playing out and saying that we're going to have 30 different possibilities.
I agree with most of that in principle, but the problem I have is that the premise that you make, which I don't know if the town's on board with or not, is that we are somehow, we don't have the option to look at private land. We don't really have the option for the town to buy public land, private land. I mean, there are lots of examples of towns going out and buying private land in order to do public development in the public interest. So I'm not sure. I mean, there is a big parcel. There's a Dwayne Reed parcel. I'm not suggesting it's for sale. I have no idea what it costs. But for example, that's a big piece of property that the public could say, well, look, we actually want to have our anchor not all the way down to the south. We want to put our anchor up in the town where it will do the most good, and that anchor might be, so I don't know what the public facility is. If it's a community center, fine, although I don't think the community center which is being outlined is, that program is a little bit expansive. We already have a community center which is really well subscribed with yoga and all those activities.
Yeah, but it's tiny and it's completely.
Okay.
Yeah,
fair enough. I'm sorry.
There's nothing that would preclude the town from doing that. But when we look at this plan, let's take, because you brought up the Sarah Lawrence site, right? Susan Lawrence, sorry. Susan Lawrence site. When you look at the site,
I did not bring up the Susan Lawrence site.
The one right next to it is what he's referring to.
You're
in the right general area.
The Dwayne Reed site. Don't take the Susan Lawrence site.
Right. So let's take this one. Sorry. So when you take a look at this one again, we're not going to propose that you move Greeley, right? We're going to propose in the form-based code that there's a build-to line which runs along Greeley that has a certain building height maximum and maybe a minimum, that it has a certain frontage occupancy, that it has certain regulations that go with that.
I understand
So
that, but
nowhere in there does it preclude the town from deciding, I'm gonna buy that. But what we are saying is, but here are the form standards that whatever happens there should occur.
what you're suggesting, I think you're suggesting, is a plan which is much more specific on the public-owned property. And the investments that would be made there are investments that you, even if you wanted to use a form-based code to do it in North Greeley, you couldn't do it because you've already placed your bets in the south end. I mean, I guess I don't know.
No, it's not the case. I mean, in reality, what's going to happen is you're codifying this edge, right, at Greeley, let's take, for example, here. What happens inside of the block is up to whoever owns it. That could be the town if they purchased it, it could be the existing landowner. Those decisions are decisions that are going to be made over many, many years.
But Eric, I thought this is Randy Catchus, I thought the concept of the form-based code was kind of like a development zone, in that once you decide, you think, or the town decides that they have a framework where they'd like things to be concentrated and how they'd like those areas to be dealt with over time, the form-based code would create an incentive, or I call it development zone, where you would incent those people to perform a certain way. And so until we know how we want them to perform in that particular block or zone, then we can't develop the code.
So I think that's yes and no. So what I would say is that you're creating incentives, for example, let's pick this area here, right? The form-based code will come in and it would say, you're allowed to do 4-story buildings, and your parking ratio is X. So what happens there then is that that's the incentive for somebody to come in and say, well, financially, that would make sense for me to go and do something, therefore I'll do it. But this particular landowner could also make the decision to say, no, I'm happy with what I have.
I agree with that, but there's a numeric way to make that, to place that bet and make it a better bet, like to handicap that, and that's just math. But if you wanted somebody to help build a community center, you could offer them 5 stories on the train track to help build a community center and build structured parking across the street with a bond, and say, look, if you're willing to buy this piece of property, put a ground floor community center, I'll give you 5 stories above it of residential, and I'll build a structured parking across the street. That's a different equation in a development zone.
You absolutely could do that, but that's outside of the form-based code. That's really about the town and their strategy. So, for example, let's say that we do the form-based code. There's a lot of jurisdictions that does this, right? You do the form-based code, and then you put out an RFP for a developer. It's at that point, because you own the land, that you can negotiate any kind of a deal that you want to with that person, right? With that developer, or let's say with this particular landowner, right? You could come back and you could say, well, we'd really like to have our city hall here. We'd love to come over here and provide you with this piece of land over here in exchange for that. But again, that's a different track than the form-based
So
code.
you don't think the form-based code should incent assemblage of property? It just sets a code for each individual property owner, but the next step would be to create development zones that would incent assemblage.
I think that certainly you could. I'll tell you that there are some jurisdictions where they do that, but they're typically where there's high demand and high likelihood of people redeveloping.
Well, I'll tell you how you incent development is you create value, right? And you create value by changing the zoning and in order to allow more density, for example. I mean, the public things that the public does. And one of the things that the public can do is actually make facility investments in areas in order to increase value. And I see the facility investment of a community center, for example, next to the town hall. There is no reason for a community center to be next to this building. There is absolutely no relationship between the two. I don't think there is. I don't know why anybody would want to come down here to go to the community center anyway. So in all of your plans, you have a community center located to the south as some sort of a civic center concept as an anchor, when I think you could be leveraging that investment where the property owners would love to have that happen to help them develop their property.
Yeah, so Yeah, there are two things there. One of the things we should be clear about with a community center and a fitness center, et cetera, is that, especially because what I've heard is that this would really only be for residents of the town, is that what you would really be doing is enticing people who are in the town to come there.
Yeah.
But you're actually not going to be bringing people from outside the town to come here for that reason.
But that doesn't exclude the other things that would bring people in, right? I mean, the community center is gonna be for people, that your proposal is gonna be for people who are in town. So the fact that it's a pool and not a community center doesn't change, right? So the other things that you have in your plan, I think, the notion is that this kind of density will stimulate enough foot traffic, even if there isn't a lot going on in the shops. People like to go where people are, right? So if you get people on the street, walking on the street, people are gonna wanna come down there. Now, I don't think that that's gonna transform our hamlet. I don't think that it's gonna get the cash registers ringing a little bit more, but it will make it feel more active. But if we're actually pitching our future, relying on our future to the retail marketplace to save us in perpetuity, I think that's a risky bet. I just think it is. So again, I believe the density's fine, but I wonder to what aim, because I'm not sure it's gonna make that big a difference for the shops. If it's based on the notion of the transect, if it's based on the notion of Forest Hills Gardens, if it's based on the notion of Scarsdale, where you have these like big buildings around the train station, and it gets less and less dense as you go out, I understand that as a model. I mean, I get it as a model, it's an obvious one. But I don't know why that necessarily should apply here just as a physical model if it's really not doing anything for us, because my guess, you're gonna get a big pushback from people in town when you tell them you're gonna have 5-story buildings around that train station. I just think it's gonna be a problem for us, I really do. You're gonna have to say, okay, what's in it for me, right? One of the reasons I came here is because there aren't any 5-story buildings. And in particular, in scenario number 3, I worry, those are super block developments. I mean, that is those are 2 really big buildings on the other side of this train station. I don't know how many parking levels there are under these things, but that's a super block development.
So can I just respond to that for 2 seconds? So I actually think, Tom, and I agree, but I think there are ways, as we saw in the pictures that Eric provided last week. First, there are ways that you can make a 5-story building actually look quaint and nice, as opposed to a big, super block rectangle. I think there are ways we could make it look nice, and I actually think that a lot of people will use the community center. I mean, people use the senior center now. I think if it was bigger and more robust, we would get a lot of people using that, and a lot of people coming down. And what it also does, which it doesn't necessarily show here, is it could open up where the current community center is, a path to the parking behind those stores too, which it doesn't show, which would be quite helpful for a lot of people, I think. But I actually really like this scenario 3, because I think you'd get more people living here who don't necessarily have to live right smack in the center. In fact, I would think we don't necessarily want that. People can walk. This is not actually that far. And you go, I mean, I was just in 3 different cities this weekend, and we walked a ton.
Yeah, you're in the city.
But I do it in suburbs too. I don't mind walking, and I think people have gotten so used to I must get in my car and be directly in front of a store. This is really not that far, and if there's actually a destination, I mean, just from walking recently, I know if I see that there's nothing in the distance, I'm not going to go down there because I think it's deserted. But I do think if there are things on this end now to draw people, you will get people walking here, and you will get people going from the community center to those stores around the train station, and then to the other stores on the rest of the.
But I have to, it's Randy again. I have to say one of the issues is we've taken public space and we've created a new town footprint. Right, that's what's happening here. We've taken public space and we've created new retail and residential space.
Right.
What it hasn't done is transform the existing structures so that we've made the hamlet better. We've just said, okay, we can't touch this because it's too small, so we're going to move this in and build some new stuff.
But we're going to change the zonings to allow people to do that.
But I'm not sure that
let me pause a minute, right?
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. We're creating a code. The code is gonna set the form or the shape of what the private property owners who own those real retail spaces can do.
Right.
Contingent with the form is what Rest Group is doing that's going to give us guidance on the types of programming we should expect and what we can do to incentivize. That's a separate decision. We can't put that in a code.
No, I agree, but here's my problem. If you're putting a 5-story building outside the train station residential, there's no reason to have a code down on South Greeley Avenue for a 4-story building with residential. I think it's too much, right?
Well, then that's a density,
You're gonna start to
then
get a
that's a density
you're gonna start to get a
question.
density
I think
issue,
we're-
so.
We only have about 5 minutes left. We had some more slides to talk about parking
Okay, so go.
Yeah.
requirements.
Keep going.
But Eric,
let's run through it
maybe you
quickly.
wanna just wrap up
Well,
Yeah,
so we
this is
can come
huge.
back to
Good.
the parking requirements another time?
I think we could do the parking requirements in the next meeting. I don't
Yeah.
think they're that critical to this discussion at this point. I think we're using them, or we will use them, but we'll come back and present that to you.
Okay,
But
so
I do
can I
think,
just make one
I would
comment?
say, for example, we showed, let's take these buildings on Allen, right? We showed these the way that they are today because we think that that's the most likely thing to happen. Even with an incentive of being able to build to whatever it is, let's say 4 stories, I don't think that people are going to tear these buildings down and build new ones anytime soon.
I totally disagree.
I would too.
Totally disagree, because I know a landowner who wants to do that now and can't
waiting.
because there's a moratorium.
Right.
So we're,
But is that a single landowner, or is that him along with the other 5 landowners on that street?
But it's in the
but
middle,
that doesn't negate that the other ones, I mean, I don't understand this conversation, I actually
It's a
don't.
math.
I mean, I thought that it was our responsibility to actually figure out how to do this, rather than saying it's not gonna happen. And I'm frustrated because, I mean, I'm sorry, just let me finish. I feel like other than the idea of some kind of a market hall, which again is dependent on retail market, right? Retailers getting in there and surviving in that location, which is kind of suspect for the use that you recommend anyway. I don't see anything in North Greeley. I feel like we just, in a parking garage, which I don't think is gonna work, we just abandoned it, which means we've abandoned the crossroads of town, I think.
Right.
here's what, I feel like the train station municipal area of this plan is driving the whole conversation, and it's a separate thing from what I believe we were gonna do, which would have focused on North Greeley and King Street,
heart of town.
and what those existing properties should be and should become. So, my opinion, we should separate out the whole train station municipal area development scenario. That could be a totally separate conversation from,
Well, it's
right
an-
now
it's
you
an
have
option.
people who wanna build on those lots that we haven't talked about at all, what that form-based
Yeah, but
code
we
looks
have
like.
talked about what the form-based is. I disagree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with your point. We have talked about the 4 stories. We've talked about the architectural detailing. The consultants need a framework within which to write this code. The thoughts behind that framework are creating the civic spaces. He showed the picture of the blue dots and the yellow streets. That is pivotal to creating a form-based code. The larger discussion of how tall the building is and what kind of parking structure is a later discussion. This is about all of those property owners on Lower King can build to a certain height. They will have certain architectural detailing that will be needed. This is not stopping them from doing it. And the assumptions are they'll be able to park it. The question is, what is needed to park that?
So, what if we disagree with the blue dots and the yellow lines?
Then now is the time for you to disagree
Well, I have been
with
saying
that.
it. That's what I've been saying the whole
Lori.
time.
I'm sorry to interrupt. My general, I've been to these 2 meetings, and as a resident here who lives downtown, the general consensus I hear is that folks are not excited about building more around the circle at the train station, and I agree with that because although that has worked in other towns, our town's not a cookie cutter town where we replicate some other model like Armonk or Pleasantville. We really love the bucolic beauty of this town. And for me, I agree with Bill and Tom about the Civic Center being so far from the retail center because isn't there opportunity behind the pizza station where there's that parking lot, is that public land? Like, I think that would be a much better location for a community center where the high school, who has like the best swimming team, doesn't even have an indoor pool to practice at. And that's where you also can get other towns to come into Chappaqua. So I understand why you're trying to zone things in a very kind of methodical way. At the same time, I thought that the purpose of this too is to help our hamlet and our downtown economic structure.
Right, but I think that I'm concerned about this notion of bifurcating the discussion with regard to the Greeley-King intersection and this, sort of scenario 2, scenario 3 kind of discussion. So I feel like you have to analyze the totality of it, because if we start separating the conversations, we're not gonna create the kind of walking conditions that we're gonna need in order ultimately to support the retailers.
And we have commissioned a generic environmental impact statement which needs to look at the worst case scenario. Because part of the process that we promised to the existing property owners was a not getting caught up for 25 years in the town processes like the Armonk Square did. Okay, so the worst case scenario is what we're looking at in the sense of scenario 3.
Yeah, but
The
we
key on
understand
all
that.
of these, it seems to me, the key on all of this as we look at our form base is that we just don't put a 4 or 5 story whatever here or there, whatever, right? There has to be a why. Yeah. And that's what is missing here so far, that I feel that we're getting closer, but there has to be a why. Why are we putting the 4 and 5 story there? What's gonna support it? I agree with, Eric told us last time that no matter what we do with density on residential, it's going to be insufficient to support alone the commercial in this area. So we have to have a why. Tom keeps driving at this. Why are we bringing people down here? You have a town park down here, it's, down by the train station. Is that the why? Is that the why, the reason why Bill's client is gonna build a 4-story structure wants to build on North Greeley?
Yeah.
I don't think it is the why. So we need to understand that why and give that to Eric and his team and understand why we're doing this.
I mean, isn't the why what's in the comprehensive plan?
Yes, it is, but this is.
And one of the big whys is I've probably talked to like 50 people in the last couple weeks who say, the second my kids are out of Greeley, I'm out of here because I don't want to deal with my big house anymore. But they all say, but we want to move nearby because all of our friends are still here. So that or something downtown might be great, that people can stay within their community but move out of their giant house and have a place to move.
I don't think
stay in town.
I don't think that any, I'm sorry, excuse me.
Which I think your comprehensive plan.
Hello, excuse me, just one more. I don't think that anybody's saying there shouldn't be multifamily residential. I really believe that that's fundamental. I think the question is how much and where. That's the fundamental question.
Exactly, and how it will work, because to your point, it has to all work together. I agree, we should not bifurcate this. It's all one big thing, so there's gotta be a reason why we're gonna put a civic area in a civic area.
Okay, so
And I haven't seen that answer
when
yet.
they showed us the scoring against the goals and objectives we set out in the comprehensive plan, do you see the rationale? Do you see the link back to that, or do you disagree with the calculation of those scores? I mean, I think that's
disagree
their.
with the solution to those problems.
I disagree with the calculation.
Yeah, I disagree with the calculation.
Calculations, that doesn't make sense.
We have no idea, right? We need to go through that and decide, is that really?
Well, then maybe we should
the-
take a look
the
at the
right
scoring and
answers.
see
Oh, that's gonna
where
be
the,
how-
no,
That'll
the
be
scorings that
another
they came up
I
with.
understand.
And just see, are these although the numbers may work, is that the priority we wanted?
Well, the reason I disagree with the scoring is a bigger score is not necessarily better. That does not make sense to me.
And that may be, but then we have to take a look at it, and maybe there are certain goals and objectives that are weighted more.
And they didn't weight them.
Exactly right.
Eric, can you go to
That's
the
our
slide
decision
that has
to
the,
make.
But that's
the
our
goals
decision.
and
I love it.
I love it.
That's not
Scenarios
fair.
Rated scoring
Yeah, but
process.
they didn't even invite us to weight them.
Okay, but they are out outsiders looking at our comp plan, and these are and I'd like an opportunity to take a look at these and dissect them and see whether or not they're giving proper weight to
These are very
goals.
subjective numbers. I mean, all of us will have our own subjective opinion about whether that category should get a 2 or a 3 or a 4, so
Right, but
we should go through that. I
We
just
should
feel
go
like
through it, but
that should be our
if I could just go back to this property just for 2 seconds, and that is that Tom made a very valid point earlier on, which is that our tiny little community center, which I have to laugh about because it's not even handicapped accessible and it's our senior center, so wrap your head around that just for a minute, okay?
Wow.
Is very well attended, but it would also make a charming restaurant or something adjacent to a charming firehouse, you know, performance space across the street. It would be unbelievable.
They don't live.
Okay,
They don't live
so,
there. They can't stay alive.
right, so the thing is that we have an anchor across the street. That library is a regional draw. The programs that library put on draw from all over Westchester County.
Yep.
With all respect, this is a prime location for an enhanced community and civic center. We need some sort of, you know, community center here, whether it's large enough or not to accommodate a pool. You know, I don't.
I understand, that's fine, I understand.
But I have to tell you that our kids, our middle schoolers, are looking for a place to hang. We really want to give them an appropriate space. We have no space for them.
Well, I don't think anybody's necessarily arguing that it shouldn't be a community center. I said, maybe I didn't think, but I think the consensus might be that, yes, we should have one.
Right.
My contention is that we seem to be just saying it has to be here. It has to be here, it can't be anywhere else.
I think its proximity to the middle school makes it the logical location.
But if you put it, Bronxville, right? Bronxville has got its high school, which is sort of right there on Main Street.
Right.
And those kids during lunch, they're going up and down that street. So, which is great, right? So if you put the community center at the other end, right? Kids from this school will go through the downtown.
But we don't
to get-
own property over there.
But you can,
But
you can buy the
you're
property.
assuming we can purchase it, and we don't know that we can. And I don't know that anybody has the stomach for them.
Okay, so
there you go.
speaking of middle
So
schoolers
that's
who
the
have
problem.
nothing to do
That's
after
the
school,
problem.
mine is about to get out of bell right now and it's banned lunch. So can we talk about what the next steps are from here?
Yeah, we better, I think it'd be good to understand.
I'd like to highlight one thing. So
Yeah.
again, the decision about where a community center might go is not necessarily going to sort of change radically the framework, right? So if you decided I want to go up and I want to buy 30 properties to build a new swimming community center and another 20, 30, 40 to build enough garage parking spaces for it up in the north, you could do that, right? But the code and the framework isn't really going to change.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what we're really trying to get to now are a couple of things. One is the framework. The second is starting to get a sense of the standards. In other words, are you going to allow 5 or is it really 4? That's part of what we're going to do. What Patty's going to do is kind of look at that and say, well, do we think, 4 would work financially? Maybe it would. And maybe you don't need to do 5 stores. But those are the kinds of things that we need to start kind of honing in on. And then I forgot my third one.
So we next meet physically on the 17th of July.
In front of the public.
No.
That's the
We
23rd.
move the public meetings to the 23rd, so we should be prepared on the 17th at some point during that meeting, and that's at town hall meeting, to make sure we have enough time for you to present the information you need to present, and that we can all have a good understanding of what will be presented to the public on the 23rd.
Right.
That's
So I
the
forgot. I remembered the third one. Sorry. So the other one was what we need to know is, yes, you're considering a community center, a health and wellness center here in downtown Chappaqua. We don't really have to know yet where it's going, but we do need to know that it's something that's being considered because we need to understand that for the build-out analysis and for the seeker.
Right.
So does everybody around this table agree with that statement, or no?
Yes.
I agree
I
with
do.
that.
You have consensus that that is the path, that everybody wants
Okay,
a
and then
community center?
the one other thing I would say is, when I look at this, I see it as unlikely that people want to, 5, 6, 7 people are going to get together and they're going to build it. Certainly for the full build-out scenario, if that's a possibility, that's something we should look at and consider, right? For the full kind of potential build-out. The last thing you want to do is kind of go through the seeker process and then say, oh, well, we didn't account for enough. So for the area at the intersection of Greeley and King and that kind of area, we can certainly draw some things and project kind of additional development. I don't think that the framework is going to change, though, or the physical standards about building height, for example, or the build-to lines are going to change. But the potential build-out certainly would change. The numbers would go up. Understand?
Yep.
So I have a question, and Ivy, when we talked the other day, are we at a comfort level here that when we meet on the 17th, we're gonna have something that we wanna present to the public? Do we think we're that close?
What are you anticipating to present to the public? I guess, what's the public?
Looking at this.
Eric, maybe you can talk to the group real quickly about what you anticipate to present to the public on the 23rd.
Ideally on the 23rd, and then this is the question about whether the working group thinks that we can get there and whether there's enough consensus today. What we would be looking to present is some of the analysis that we've done, some of the history, for example, some of the rationale for why we're doing this, the actual framework, in other words, a preliminary kind of regulating plan, but without any buildings, a set of diagrams that talk about these are the areas where we think 5 is appropriate max, this is 4 appropriate max, this is 3 appropriate max. Talk about the specific kind of standards like the build-to line, what does that section look like? Those, some precedents for the public space, if everybody agrees that the memorial public space would be better, bigger than smaller, some things about that. And so we're really starting to kind of get to say, this is what the consensus is on these kinds of things. In addition, we had in our scope to produce a sketch model and some perspectives. So this would be sort of saying, okay, this is our kind of full build-out scenario. What does that mean? What does that actually really look like? And so here you are standing on the ground, you're looking across the street, and this is what it looks like.
So are you anticipating, Eric, putting out, scenario 3 or 2, or showing them those scenarios where the physical locations are determined? Or suggested, I guess.
So again, we would be kind of saying, here's the framework without buildings, right, and a set of diagrams, and then this is a theoretical what it could look like, what it could be.
And we'll be taking a look at that theoretical, what it could look like on the 17th.
Right, I mean, we've been taking a look at that.
I'm thinking the SketchUp models and so forth.
Yeah, got it.
Will those be ready for the 17th?
Right, and there'd be a revised version of the plan that you see here.
Great.
Right,
We've emailed copies of this, right?
You will have, you will.
Okay.
Here, Eric, one thing that I think will be essential, and if possible to kind of circulate beforehand, is the framework slide. That shows the framework. We have not had that. I know it's in development and you're working on it, but maybe before the meeting on the 17th, if there's enough time to get that information before the meeting. If not, we need to spend a lot of time early on in that meeting discussion
No, I
talking
think that's
about that
important
framework.
because we can come to the meeting informed as
Right.
opposed to seeing it for the first time.
Right,
I think it's very
right.
important.
We're not seeing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, we can do that.
Okay.
But so, again, if we put on our kind of SimCity hat, and we sort of say nobody has a crystal ball, but if we looked at scenario 3 and we were to increase the amount of redevelopment on King and Greeley in that area, right?
By the way, when we were talking about the food hall, I think that that's a scenario where that could also be residential development. But if we were to do that, does it sound like we're kind of in consensus here about the traits?
Call in?
Hello?
Hello?
Hello, what happened?
Hello?
Hello?
Hi.
Hi.
You didn't hear me?
No.
Consensus about the framework was the last thing we heard.
Okay. So what I was asking was, do we think that there's a general consensus today that the framework that we're talking about here, that something like scenario 3, whether it's 5 or 4 stories, with additional development at King and Greeley, kind of more redevelopment up there, we can envision that, right? Are we in agreement that this is the basic framework?
I think you're hearing silence for a reason. I think there's some concern about the level of development around the circle in particular.
I'm a yes, I like it.
Yeah,
I'm a yes on this.
I think I agree with the dots. I'm not so sure about the size of the respective
Yep.
blue dots.
Yep.
But I think the channeling and the street development seems to be logical, makes sense.
Yep.
We may have some discussions about the size of the blue dots.
Absolutely.
Well, the size of the blue dot at the train
what's in them?
station
And what's in them?
Well,
is pretty set because of the landmark. Okay, you can make it bigger
Right.
than what is there today.
You can't make small.
You cannot make it smaller. That 200-foot radius from that train station is forever protected.
We don't wanna
No,
make it
we're not
smaller
talking, we
anyway.
understand.
Yeah,
Nobody
we
wants
don't
to
wanna
make it
make
talk
smaller.
about the scope, I guess the blue dot signifies to me the scope of development, so I'm not so sure that North Greeley's blue dot should not be a little bit larger if we can figure out a way to do that.
And I feel uncomfortable with the notion that the town square sounds like it's gravitating to the semicircle in front of the train station. And again, if that's to be the programmed activity center of the town, I feel like we're making orphans of the merchants who are up at King and Greeley.
And perhaps orphans might be too strong a word, but we're not enhancing it to the extent
We're not
that we
helping.
probably
We're
committed to
actually
that
drawing,
Chappaqua crossing.
we're
But that's
drawing.
why I think we do have to put something kind of where Rite Aid is, where
Yeah.
that dot is. And I actually like the idea of a food hall, but we can't mandate what's gonna be there because we don't
It's not
own that
possible.
property.
It's I understand,
Well,
the
but
use
I
would be
also-
great, but I think that's tough for a location for
I also
retail.
think, Tom, that there's things that we can do from a policy perspective that are outside of the scope of this project as well.
Oh, absolutely.
No question. You got a lot
In
of-
fact, we should not get.
You got a lot of playing cards.
Okay, it's 11, it's
Public
11,
space.
20,
Public
11:18, so I'm gonna end this call. Eric, do you have anything else you'd like to say or direct the group to do?
I think that what I'm hearing is that there's a little bit of disagreement, but people are generally fine with the framework.
Yes.
I think that there's some discussion about kind of the significance of an element to the north. And I think that's what I'm hearing. And so what I would recommend that our next step be is actually to produce kind of a draft regulating plan that we can then take a look at.
Yep.
Start looking at some of the diagrams of building heights and things like that. That'll kind of help us be a little more
They
specific.
took your hats off.
That sounds good to me.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.